Historic leadership changes in Cuba. That's right. Raul Castro recently stepped down as the head of the Communist Party, and that leaves the island nation without a Castro in the top leadership role for the first time in more than 60 years. The party's new leader, he faces some daunting challenges, among them an ailing economy, harsh economic sanctions imposed by the U.S., and of course, a global pandemic. For insight on the situation, we looked toward our friend, Vito Echevarria. He's a journalist with the CubaStandard online publication, and Tom Popper, he's the founder of the Insight Cuba travel agency. Vito, good to see you again, my friend. Thanks for joining us here on Tiempo once more. Tom, welcome. I think you'll enjoy your first experience here with us. We'll go easy on you, don't worry. Let me ask you, this is monumental change at the top in Cuba. It made news all over the place because for the first time in more than 60 years, there's someone not named Castro leading the Communist Party. Give me a one-word answer and then your explanation. Do you see any sort of significant change for the people on the island as a result of this leadership change?
Nothing yet.
No.
And that's precisely because everything's happening in Cuba depends on what's happening in the United States.
Well, let me rephrase it this way. Should Cuban Americans here in the New York metropolitan area and across the United States see any sort of significant change in their lives as a result of the leadership change in Cuba?
Not really. I mean, Diaz-Canel is there because he's basically going to continue. He represents a continuation of the Castro regime, basically. So he's heading the government and all that, but you still have relatives of Raul Castro in the government.
Mm-hmm.
So just because of that, you will not see any significant change there. And I would dare say that if anything does change, it's going to be because of the United States.
Okay. You jumped the gun a little bit with the new president for me. So before I get to you, Tom, I haven't forgotten about you. Vito, one more question. Tell me a little bit about who's succeeding Raul Castro now as the head, 60-year-old Miguel Diaz-Canel. Was the president for the last, I think, 3 years, and is now moving into this additional role as the leader of the Communist Party. What do we know about him?
Well, I mean, like I said, basically, he's somebody who's been groomed for a long time to take over the realms of power when Raul Castro retired, because it was just a matter of time before it was going to happen. Obviously, Raul's daughter, Mariela, did say a few years ago that this day would come when Raul would step down and a younger generation of leadership would assume power and take the country into a new direction.
Tom, you run a travel agency, do you not?
Yeah, called Insight Cuba. We've been providing legal travel to Cuba for Americans for more than 20 years.
From your perspective and from your business, what does the change in Cuba mean for you and your operations?
Well, change is always a good thing in the travel industry. Nothing ever remains the same, but our anticipation is we have younger leadership at the top of the government. There's been a lot of discussion. There's also been a lot of change that has happened since President Obama was president. And while change does happen slowly, I agree with Vito. A lot of it's going to depend on the U.S., but I do think there's desire and there's appetite for change, and I think they're going to be pushing some forward.
Do you foresee new opportunities in the area of travel, of remittances, of visitation?
Well, we've already started to see prior to this changes in regulations with regard to foreign direct investment and other regulations about leases, land leases, so hotels. It's more business friendly if you're a hotelier and you want to build there. So these changes are huge. We've not seen anything like it since the revolution. So we do anticipate when things start to change on the U.S. side, there'll be business minds will warm up to engaging with Cuba more so.
Vito, Miguel Diaz-Canel, the new leader there, he's going to have, I guess, some hurdles to overcome, wouldn't you say? The economy, if my figures are correct, is ailing. Last year shrank by 11%. The pandemic has had a huge impact on the island. How much pressure will he be under to make the changes that are needed to get Cuba back on good financial footing?
Yeah, I mean, basically, he has two issues to deal with. The first issue is COVID itself. COVID has a huge impact on Cuba's tourism sector. I mean, it's a huge nosedive in the number of international visitors, those coming from places like Canada, Europe into Cuba. So it's had detrimental impact not only on the state-run tourism outfits, but also you have to remember Cuba does have a private sector. You have everybody from the cuento propistas, small businesses, to taxi drivers, to those that run casas particulares, the Airbnb-friendly private homes that are available for rental for tourists at a deep discount.
Yep.
So COVID has had a hugely negative impact upon tourism. Miguel Diaz-Canel is going to have to deal with that, as well as, of course, how the U.S. treats Cuba in the foreseeable future.
That's a good segue into our next segment. We're up against our first break, but when we come back, let's talk a little bit about this administration, the previous administration, and their relationship with the island and what we see moving forward. So sit tight. We're coming right back. Vito and Tom, thanks for staying with us to talk about the changes that are underway and are now happening in Cuba. Let me ask you this. Some things haven't changed, Vito. The long lines for people just to get some everyday goods, that continues to this day. Do you see it getting better before it gets worse, or the other way around?
Nah, it's definitely not getting better. It's still a serious problem getting certain essential food items in Cuba. Obviously, those that have been going back and forth to the island in recent years have noticed, in particular, a shortage of local branded beers, such as Bucanero and Cristal in particular, to the point where the Cuban state import agencies are forced to import beer from places like Dominican Republic, that's Presidente beer, mm-hmm. and then, of course, also Brazil, which would be the Brahma beer brand. So that's the irony. You're more likely to find those beers in Cuban store shelves than the local brands.
That's just one illustration of many. Tom, are there banking regulations that shifted along the way too that also add to the problem?
A lot of this began early on in the Trump administration. Things were cooking along pretty well under Obama, lots of revenue coming in through travel, lots of private enterprises coming up. But once the regulations changed, one of the things that got hit hard was banking regulations. So it's very difficult for foreign companies to send goods to have banking transactions with the Cubans. So we saw fuel lines, we saw food shortages, beer shortages as early as 2017 and 18 in Cuba. So the sanctions really do harm to the local people.
Vito, it doesn't appear, at least from what I've seen so far, that the Biden administration seems anxious to lift, alter, or change those sanctions that were put in place by the previous administration.
Right, that's correct. Because you have to remember what's going on between U.S. and Cuba has to do with Florida. Any new president that comes in has to think of the Florida vote. That's a factor in any presidents coming in not wanting to be too much in a hurry to do anything about Cuba. That explains, for example, why it took Obama his second term in power before he tackled the Cuba issue. Mm-hmm. So Biden, to say at least, I mean, he's not going to rush to do anything with Cuba, but if and when the time comes, he'll make some changes that he himself can do. But otherwise, it's going to have to be Congress who's going to make some changes.
But Tom, is there any way to the argument that in light of everything that's going on in the world, President Biden right now might have, for lack of a better term, bigger fish to fry than to deal with Cuba?
He's got his hands full. There's no two ways about it. However, he has a blueprint to be humane at a time when Cuba needs to engage with the United States, which is really just to go back to the Obama policies, which were working. They're only given 2 short years, but allow Americans to travel. That promotes private businesses. It brings revenue. It helps put food on the shelves. These are basic necessities that Cuba needs. And with the sanctions basically choking them off, on top of COVID-19 and the pandemic, which, they're under the same restrictions we are here in the U.S., it makes everything for the local population more difficult.
Do I hear you saying, therefore, that it wouldn't take a monumental effort to make those changes and eliminate some of those sanctions to free things up?
That's right. That's right. All President Biden needs to do is allow Americans to travel there and stay in hotels, allow cruise ships to return to the island, and just really revert back to the Obama policies. Trump went ahead and went roughshod over the course of 4 years over those policies, all in the end hurting local Cuban people.
Dissent on the island has grown thanks largely to the internet, which is slowly starting to make its way finally to Cuba. Do you see the leadership change as an opportunity for dissidents to maybe apply a little bit more pressure because they have a new platform to work with?
there's always been a certain level of dissent in Cuba, and that has not changed, obviously. I will bring this, though. This explains why Cuba has been very slow to embrace, technology, if you will. This explains, for example, why you're not going to see 5G technology on the island anytime soon, because the Cuban government is in no hurry, for example, for video calls like the ones that we're doing right now to take place between Cuba and the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. They want to maintain tight control over communications.
I would guess they look at social media and the role that it's had here in the United States and say, we want no part of that right now. Gentlemen, a pleasure. Big changes at the top, but from someone who says continuity quite often, Mr. Diaz-Canel, it doesn't sound like there'll be much reform in the weeks, months, and years ahead. So keep us posted, if you would, along the way.